It wouldn't be a Monday if I didn't have, even off screen, where there was a mess up of something. I had to like rejigger everything, but we're good now.
It's hopefully. Just preparing. It's just preparing for the week.
Extra preparing. That's right.
Well, good morning and welcome to the latest episode of the Project Failure Files, the series for anyone who manages people, projects, processes for a living.
Things, right, stuff.
Things, cats, whatever it is that you manage. I'm Sharon Weaver, CEO of Smarter Consulting.
And I am Christian Buckley, can't get the tunes out of the head, founder of Collab Talk. And welcome to another episode of our series where we explore project management topics and leadership development projects, a lot of the soft skill topics from the perspective of what not to do as you manage projects. In each episode, we talk about the common pitfalls, share some personal stories and experiences, and we have many of those, and explore strategies and best practices to help you to be successful.
So in this episode, we are talking about managing across geographies and the balance between supporting company culture, but also recognizing the unique needs of different people and teams in other regions or other countries even.
Yeah, we did a similar topic for those that are following the series a few months back. I don't know, it could have been weeks ago, a month ago, don't know. But where we talked about not treating all projects the same. And I seem to recall also dipping our toes into this, like the geographically dispersed teams.
Yeah, I think that episode was more about the methodology used to manage the projects specifically, and like making adjustments for the projects. But, definitely we want to do that, for all of the different team members, no matter whether they're internal, external, customers, team members, stakeholders, all the different people.
It's interesting now. I know so many companies, especially startups and smaller organizations, and your company, Smarter Consulting. I mean, everybody's virtual. Nobody's in the same location. I've got some experience though managing geographically dispersed teams and projects, across different countries. I guess it's pretty much the norm these days in the modern workplace that you'll rarely have everybody on your project in a single location. I've managed teams in the UK, India, Australia, and Japan in my career. I used to live in Northern California, and I did a lot of APAC projects and had a team and counterparts and projects that were over in Taiwan and Japan and South Korea, the Philippines. And getting all the stakeholders onto the same calls was difficult enough when you're working with one region. I had a couple projects where we had people in India and Australia and the US and Europe, and we could never get everybody on the same call because it was always the middle of the night for one. And so we had to do a lot of recordings. I usually suffered the middle of the night calls so that everybody else could be there. But yeah, I did that for years.
Yeah, it can definitely be done for sure. My background, I grew up in software development. And so, offshoring and nearshoring and working with diverse teams around the world has been the norm my entire career. And it's everything from managing people to working with people to communicating with people. And same thing, like I've been on calls at 2:00 in the morning. I've been calls, Saturday afternoons. I got used to it for a really long time. And I think, now I think the world is becoming a little bit more normalized. I think people are becoming a little more comfortable with being able to like send a message and know asynchronously that, you're going to respond whenever works best for you. I think at the end of the day, it really just requires a lot of planning and organization and good communication and definitely some flexibility and, being willing to work with people on scheduling.
For sure. Lots of stories. I just was thinking of one in particular that I'm sure we'll get into. And it's going to be another great conversation. And as with every episode, please feel free to comment throughout the episode, share your experiences, any examples or feedbacks that we may have missed. And as I like to do, I'll pop this up here. And please go over and subscribe. If you go over to projectfailurefiles.com, you can leave us feedback. You can sign up for the newsletter, which eventually we'll kick this thing off. So make sure that you sign up for that. And with that, let's jump into it and get things going.
Yeah, let's start with some definitions.
Yeah, it's geographically dispersed. So, I mean, I
don't think we need to really define that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I was thinking of a great example. For about a year, I had 10 p.m. meetings every Sunday through Thursday, managing an engineering team that was in Ahmedabad, India, and got to go over back in 2010 and visit the team. That's actually something I guess we're going to get into it. I'll kind of kick it off with this. What not to do is to never have face-to-face with your geographically dispersed team.
At least if possible. There really are
Right.
some opportunities where you're working with people around the world where you're probably never going to get that opportunity. But I 100% think if you do not take advantage of the opportunities to do that,
Right.
then that is definitely what not to do.
Well, I worked with the team for a year and a half in Bratislava that just I never got over. Getting the invite, said, you got to come over. I was like, it just never worked out with back in my heavy event rotation days, like over to Central Eastern Europe. It just never was a thing. And so, but one thing I learned, especially working with when I was working with the team in India, in this example, I had an architect that was down in Australia, the engineering team in India, a designer, a person over in the UK, and myself working out of Seattle at the time. And we were, I got introduced to a bunch of the cultural aspects for the region. And so here's just a great example. Like Ahmedabad, for folks that don't know, in India, which is over on the western side, is more of an it's a massive city. I don't know how many millions of people over there. It's very, very crowded, very hot, but it's more of the agriculture belt. And it's actually, Gandhi spent a good portion of his life there, and his ashram I walked by it, drove by it every day as we commuted into where the team was. But started to get introduced to some of the cultural aspects of, because we had some people that were there that were out in this, it's not a part of India where you think of the high tech being. That's over other major cities, but these were people that were more religious, that were more family oriented, and so they just had roots in that part of the country, and so they had spent time over in the big cities, bigger cities, I should say, kind of coming up to speed in tech. But adjusting to their schedules and to the recognition of some of the holidays that they celebrated, all those kinds of things, we constantly made adjustments for that. So I don't know, anything else. One of the things I think that, Sharon, we as Americans, we have the major holidays and things that we kind of adjust for, but we are such workaholics that we have no problem working through. And sometimes you need to remember that, hey, that's not the custom, and this is taken more personally seriously in other regions, other geographies, to make adjustments. That's one example, the cultural aspect of it. But
yeah, I definitely think, I mean, in this, everything from, managing your time is more of a logistical problem, right? It's more just what schedules are we available versus what you're available. But I agree. I think the cultural impacts are huge. I've worked with a number of Indians over the years, both, in India and them coming over here. And I think, one of the things I think about is, we had a group of Indians that worked with us at a company that I worked at, and they took tea every afternoon. And it was very important to them, right, to have that break. And here in America, in the States, I don't, it's like I'm not sure a shift worker that is required to take your break at a certain time. For the most part, definitely in corporate America, breaks are not as sacred, I think, as
right.
they really took their teas every afternoon. And that was a big cultural thing, because a lot of the managers were very frustrated about them taking a long break in the afternoon. And I'm like, look, this is part of their culture. It's part of their customs. They need a break. But they were also the earliest to get up and get in, and they were there late. And, so I think there was that cultural piece of really recognizing this as just part of how they work. And then also, we work with people in Europe on a regular basis, and a lot of them will take anything from during the summers. A lot of times they'll take off at noon for the rest of the day. They don't work in the afternoons. Some places they're mandatory. They'll take 4, 5, 6 weeks of time off, because they need to rest and recharge. Which once again in the States, and this is a whole other conversation from a cultural aspect, but we do not really respect that kind of need for time off.
Topic idea. Oh,
yeah. Resting and recharging. And I think when you think about the different ways that people value different things, all of a sudden when you're working with somebody, here we would say, what do you mean you're going to be back in 5 or 6 weeks? Are you nuts? Like, you're going to miss an entire project. At the same time, they say to us, what do you mean you're not going to take a break? You're far overworked and stressed out. And so I think it creates this disparity. And so what not to do when we talk about project failure files, I think if you think that everybody on the planet works the exact same way that you do, and you don't value the differences that you can learn from other cultures and other time zones, and you can't learn how to be flexible within that system, I think you're setting yourself up for a lot of problems.
Can I share? This just kind of popped in my head. It's a great, I think it kind of exposes some of what have been cultural problems in the U.S. This is a few years ago. This is pre-pandemic.
It's our show, Christian. We can say whatever we want.
I know. So a few years ago, pre-pandemic, so I was working for a company as a full-time employee. So it was before I was independent, and I was running a webinar, and they were doing construction outside of my house and on my street. Was still living up in the Seattle area, and internet went out for the neighborhood. Like, I was about 15 minutes into an hour-long discussion. I had about, 75 to 100 people on there, but lost it all. And just like, what happened? We lost power briefly, but internet was down. And it was one of those where somebody cut into lines in the ground. Right. So it was like a full day to repair that, to get everything back online. So I jump on my phone, I radio in my team out in Boston, say, hey, this is what happened. I'm trying to find out. We're just going to have to reschedule. Please apologize to everybody. There was somebody on the call, a VP with this very large global SI that will go unnamed, but they partner with Microsoft and their brand is orange. Anyway, a VP was very upset that I was so unprofessional. And I'm like, what?
Life happens.
And was enough that he contacted, I reported the CEO at the time. He contacted my company and made a complaint. And of course, my CEO, he pinged me later and he was kind of laughing about it. He's just like, who is this a-hole, kind of thing. And so it was enough. He made a comment online. He called the company to disparage me for being unprofessional in this. I'm like, wait, what are you talking about? Did you not see the email to get the response on their live? And anyway, talking with other folks that I knew at this company, I knew a couple dozen at the time. And they're just like, don't worry about it. This guy is known for this kind of stuff. But my point in telling that story and the differences between things, one of the positive things to come out of the pandemic and everybody being forced to work from home is, I think we got a lot more empathy, certainly in the US, for these kinds of things. A child or a dog or a cat to wander into the background of a live video of needing to reschedule because need to pick up kids or some other emergency. I was talking to somebody who had their child got burned or something and had to go to the emergency room. Go. I mean, obviously we'll do this again. Don't worry about it. That kind of thing. It was more difficult. You felt bad for life kind of interrupting and the adjustments there. And I don't now. You need to be professional. You need to communicate. You need to all those kinds of things. You need to support the morale of the different locations. But you have to avoid this location bias, this insider outsider dynamic that happens in projects based on where it is. And I know this is difficult. There are some companies which might be global companies, yet they operate as out of headquarters. And it's often looked at as a disadvantage to not be based out of the headquarters and everybody else is lesser kind of things. Microsoft was that way, may still be that way in some areas when I worked there, whereas very much if you weren't seen and visible at headquarters, you had no career path. Which sounds brutal out to the folks in the field. And I know that's not entirely true in different roles and different things. But again, that's just an example of what not to do. You can't do that. So I don't know things of other pitfalls of treating distributed teams like differently than your co-located teams.
Well, yeah. And I think one of the things that I experienced very early on is if you were in the office, you participated in events. So we would do birthday parties, or they would bring in treats to the office, or they would but if you were not in the office, and that didn't matter if you were down the street or if you were in a different country, oftentimes, not only were you not invited to participate in whatever was happening, and so you kind of missed out. And obviously everybody in the world doesn't want birthday cake, but the point is there, right? Like, you weren't included.
It's nice to be offered.
Not only that, but those people would go take an hour or 2 hours to go have this little party while everybody else was still expected to continue to work, because they weren't in the office, or they weren't co-located with those people. And I think it just comes down to that whole idea of treating people fairly and equally as much as possible, and recognizing that just because you're not in the exact same location or the exact same culture or the exact same time zone, that everybody still has needs and should be included as much as possible in whatever's going on.
Thinking about what not to do. I mean, one, like, as you nailed it, expecting that always on synchronous availability without regard for time zone is not a real thing. Again, that's an area which I think has been greatly improved because of the pandemic, where there's a lot more empathy. People are conscious of that. I think daily I pull up the time zone tool. Mm-hmm. There's a number of them that are out there online. So I'm looking at and I'm sensitive to, you said yes to this. It's 6 a.m. at your time. Like I run a monthly tweet jam, and I run it at 10 a.m. Pacific. And I am always amazed when we get people from New Zealand and Australia. It's the middle of their night, in the future.
Yeah.
So yeah, they
I am too.
Yeah. So it's so that's great. But for forcing uniform workflows that don't suit local technology or infrastructure constraints, this is something that's not as much of an issue. But, hey, 25 years ago, part of a solution that I was helped build and deploy had like WAN optimization, because the realization that we were doing things which required high speed internet, and there were still clients that were on dial-up.
Yeah, we had stakeholders. I worked for a global engineering, and we had stakeholders, and we struggled with some of our stakeholders that were in Australia and Africa because this was before a lot of the infrastructure that came in, and they really struggled with getting good internet. And I remember the place that I worked at was a fantastic company that I think was very mature, and they spent a lot of time, effort, and money to figure out what can we do to solve the problem. And we put redundant servers in, and we worked with those groups to try to make that experience better for them. But I think, what not to do is to say, too bad, so sad, sorry you're there. We really don't care.
Right. Well, and part of that too, and this is more from a governance perspective, but be careful in centralizing your decisions in one location without having those stakeholders, those representatives from those different regions giving input. So that's something, again, sensitive, hypersensitive to, having run these governance bodies and helping organizations to examine, to assess, to look at their process and say, where is that bias, that location bias? What can you do to adjust that? But that also then has an impact on accountability, on roles and responsibilities, giving people sufficient time to review. You should certainly have an escalation path. You should have the ability to make decisions very quickly when needed. You can't wait 24-hour cycle till everybody gives feedback. However, that should be the exception, not the rule. And it's so easy to make that, again, the project failure files version is the rule, not the exception. And that leads then to an over-reliance on micromanagement instead of a trust-based, hey, here's the process. People are going to give them the time to review this. While that lesson could be learned by the U.S. Congress, like having adequate time to actually read and review things before then voting on them. But that's crazy. That's me,
Well, and, one of the things that I noticed too is that, especially when you're dealing with people in different different areas, geographical areas, oftentimes when I think you said this in one of your bullet points, but when you have people who are making decisions on behalf of the group, but they're not like, oh, well, we have to make this decision right now. And so we're just going to make the decision, and then everybody else is just going to have to be okay with it. And I think oftentimes if that impacts those other people, but they don't have a say or they don't, have a part in that decision-making process, that can cause all kinds of, frustration and lack of trust and productivity issues. You say, hey, we're going to make this decision to do this thing going forward, but we're not going to take everybody into consideration with their needs. And all of a sudden, people aren't doing things or they're missing stuff. And then you're holding it against them because you didn't know that they couldn't make that time work, or they couldn't deliver, or they can't be available during that call because that's 2 a.m. in the morning for them, right? There's all these things that kind of come from just not including people and being patient enough to just make it work. And I'm not saying if there's something on fire, you got to deal with it, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about the larger, broader idea of kind of everyday decisions.
Well, that's why that's a great point. I mean, that's why you also, depending on the type of project that it is, and as in operations, that we actually had an escalation path that had standards for the communication. So if it did land, because we were global, in the middle of the night, that there were still texts going out, emails going out that were marked as critical path, that were high priority, whatever, so that people could set up alerts. So maybe they were on silent on their phone, but that it would actually make a sound. That didn't exist as a feature 15, 20 years ago, but it's very much a real thing now. So that people want to have a different ringtone when there's an emergency on something and a call comes in, whatever that is. There's methods for that. I look at some of my early projects when I first started working with across APAC, and I made adjustments. It's funny. So this is back around 2001 to 2004, and I worked with a lot of high-tech manufacturing companies around Asia Pacific. So that's all of those countries. We had offices in Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. I had projects with like massive companies like Hitachi, where I actually went on site to their manufacturing facility down in Philippines. Talk about dial-up. Crazy, Sharon. It was going into the office, this massive, like 10,000 workers at this massive facility, and go into the plant manager's office, and out in front, traditional Japanese, the old school Japanese, where his office had a big glass window looking down the line of a row of desks sideways that reported to him. There was a dial-up line. If they needed to plug into the internet, they would schedule a time or go and walk over, ask if it was free, go and plug it into their computer to be able to upload, download data and things from that. Seeing how all those things worked, we adjusted our expectations of responses to email. I mean, all those different things. I working for that company. I had a very long commute from the East Bay and San Francisco East Bay over to the peninsula every day, and would get up at like 4:30 in the morning to drive in for over an hour and a half to get to work, even longer to get home sometimes. But I figured out a rhythm where I was able to be on the phone, not so much in the morning, but in the afternoon, the next day with most of my clients. And so I was productive and I adjusted for that, stayed late anyway, and then adjusted for that. The downside was that what most of my partners and clients didn't realize is that like I didn't see my kids awake until the weekends.
I don't think, and I know, this is something that I reference on my other podcast. We talk about, what it takes.
Here we go. Doing a drop, dude, promoting something else. Okay.
So I have a new podcast coming out called That Glam Life. But we talk about, what it takes to be successful. And sometimes it's not that glamorous. And I think one of the things that many people don't realize is that when you work with global companies, especially in industries like software development and manufacturing and, even healthcare, I mean, there's all kinds of industries that span the globe. I don't think they really understand things like what you just mentioned in the idea of we have to shift our schedules and be on calls at 4:00 in the morning or be at calls at midnight. And I, like you, for years and years and years, I would go have my dinner, with my family, and then I would go sit in my office for 2 or 3 hours and be on calls until midnight. But then I had to be up and back in my office at my desk at 8:00 in the morning. I would have to be on calls on Saturday nights, because of the time zone differences. And I think one of the things that I would say is there's a very large cultural movement right now around the, if it doesn't suit me personally, then I'm not interested in doing it. And I will tell you from somebody who has kind of gone down that path is that if you really want to, be a good team member and be successful in any field, but especially fields like project management or product management, you really need to learn how to kind of chill out and be a little more flexible around other people's needs.
The phrase, this is the technical phrase, but that I use often in those scenarios is suck it up, buttercup. No, but you're right. It's a look. I mean, nothing worthwhile in life is easy, and so I mean, I love this. I love project management. I love this kind of work because if you have any kind of different personality, like if you've got ADHD, OCD, that kind of thing, it's very prevalent in project managers for that. Having the variety, having the problem solving, having to be able to employ your creativity on a daily basis, juggling these different pieces, it feeds into that. Like this is the right space for me for sure. You want to have work-life balance, those things. I know a lot of people, they say when they hear that phrase, they think you've already lost. Like it's when you use that phrase, if you have to balance those things, like, well, again, culturally in the US, we're workaholics. That's why our productivity numbers, that's why innovation, all those things in the US are so high, but it's also a problem. We have a lot to learn from many of these other cultures. Like, I wish I was better at taking vacations.
The rest of the world is adapting to us. And I just think that is something
I don't know that that's the greatest thing in some ways.
I know it needs to be fair. And, I will say you mentioned this earlier in the episode, but I really believe that the pandemic did us one service by really teaching us how to manage remote teams in a way that we really had never done in corporate America before. And one of the things that I witnessed is many of my clients really took that seriously. And the managers were like, look, I'm still going to do my job and I'm going to do it well. And they brought in people to run virtual parties, and they brought in people to do virtual social gatherings and, have the water cooler chats and all the things that we were missing from being in person. And a lot of that has kind of died off since the pandemic. People are kind of going back. But the truth of the matter is a lot of people have not gone back, but yet we've still lost that, that team building and team support activities that we really kind of really learned from during the pandemic. And so I think there's still, like you said, the rest of the world is kind of learning how to adapt to us. And I think we need to learn how to adapt to everybody across every culture, every time zone as much as possible.
Well, jumping into strategies, like how can we overcome this issue and some of the best practices around there? I mean, one is that we do talk about a lot is that you can't just like you and I are both believers in the structure, the methodology. It's the not the methodology at any cost. It's apply what's relevant, keep it as lean as possible, but you have the structure to rely on so that you know what questions to ask and that you're uniform, you're consistent in your delivery of projects. But you also need to constantly go back and review, is this the right methodology? Are we accounting for these different things? And so this idea of having like these team norms workshops where you're talking about specifically this area, it's like a soft skill area of, are we doing enough? What is the preferred communication? Is what we're doing working? Availability during these times, maybe where you talk about different roles. Okay, for this month, you're taking over this role. Just so you know, it's a time shift for you because of these things, and this is what you need to do. And so it's more important than anything to have clear roles and responsibilities and that communication plan. Here's when we have our calls. Here's where we do the email statuses. Here's where the dashboards are updated, or whatever those things are. And it's gotten easier because of asynchronous tools like Teams and Slack and other, co-creation of content, collaboration tools have advanced so much, even in the last 5-6 years around this thing. It makes it easier, but you have to be, I think you'd agree with this, you have to be intentional around it.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. I think having asynchronous tools, I mean, it used to be you just send an email and wait 12 hours for the email to return. Now we have asynchronous tools that we can kind of go back and forth and just respond whenever, the time zone is appropriate or whatever. I also think, when I think about like Teams Premium and being able to record all the calls, and then that can turn into action, notes and things like that. But I agree. I think just collaborative tools in general have improved drastically over the last 5 or 6 years. And so I think, definitely use them. Like, don't be like, nah, we don't need any of that stuff. Like, we'll just make it work. I mean, use the tools. That's what they're there for.
Well, and then also having process and having worked in support operations, I know you've done that as well. Like having truly followed the sun models, where it was like it was described as the football handoff, American football folks, so that you're actually holding the ball. But I know it's phrasing, it's imagery that's used in the U.S., but the idea that with a ticket that's a high prize, that it's never left untouched. Somebody owns it, has it, and when you come to the end of your shift, there's somebody in the next time zone that's taking it on and continuing the work. So you're documenting there might be SLAs, service level agreements in place around those things. That might be an approach, depending on the types of projects that you're running, to have that. If you're a global organization, to make sure, does that next team, like I'm going to sleep, does the team that's waking up over in Europe have the information that they need to continue that before they hand off for that shift next 12 hours to Asia, or next 8 hours to Asia, before I then wake up and get it again. So have that rolling handoff in between projects, and then be very clear as well, and to empower your local leaders, the PMs, the liaisons, the representatives, the stakeholders, however you're identifying those folks, of that process of the communication. And so when people come and go from projects, and if you don't have that well documented, if it's not part of your system, your methodology, and then they're going to come in and they're going to interrupt that flow. That's another mistake. What are some of your best practices, though?
I like rotating the meetings so that different people can have a different, like sometimes we're going to do, you're going to be a little inconvenienced, and sometimes I'm going to be a little inconvenienced. And also being like communicating exactly like what your expectations are. So I, for years and years and years, would be like, hey, I just want to make sure that this is what my schedule is this week. I follow my Outlook calendar like a crazy person. And anytime I onboard a new person, I'm like, make sure it's on your calendar, make sure your working hours are defined, so that I know that when I go to look, I'm not going to book something that is not going to be in your time zone and are not available.
You don't have to ask them to refresh their calendar. Is it up to date? Like You're going off of that. That's right. That is scripture. Yes.
And then recognize anybody's schedule, whether that means time off, holidays, things that they're doing that, maybe don't, that you don't think about. And that's why I think that's why calendars are so important, is because if they block a day off, there's a reason.
Right.
It doesn't matter what the reason is. It doesn't matter to me what the reason is. They're just not available during that time. And I think it's respecting those needs.
Right. Well, that's something too, and that should be discussed in advance. That should be part of the discussion, is the calendar discussion. I mean, my wife and I do this every Sunday. I'm like, what's your schedule? Here's what I have going on, to remind her, hey, I'm flying out Monday, I'm home Wednesday, this. And I was sitting yesterday, I realized that because my wife had been traveling and that I hadn't updated that fact that Sharon and I are down at a customer in Arizona for a couple days. And I said, that's next week. And she's like, when were you going to tell me? I'm like, I'm telling you right now. But we have those planning calls so that you can talk about, hey, key people are off on these days. Here's why. In this region, what are the handoffs going to be, the differences for that? Again, managing those exceptions is so much about, that's what life is about. It's got your standard way of doing that. You have then a process for managing the exceptions to that. And so it makes it easier. One other best practice, though, is, I mean, we briefly mentioned it, when possible, at least like on an annual basis, to be able to meet in person with the people that you're managing or working with. It is tremendous if you're able to do that. So I often say that during the pandemic, working with a company where I knew everybody, and I felt for the people that were being hired on, but 100% virtual, had never met anybody that they're working with. It's difficult to do that. There's a difference between the persona, what you see looking straight on in the screen, and their availability versus sitting down in a room, going and breaking bread at a restaurant for lunch or dinner and getting to know people personally. It does amazing things for communication, and again, it's easy for us to forget the humanity of our stakeholders when it's all through a screen versus I've actually met and know these people.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with that. I also think another thing we didn't mention is leading geographical teams is a special skill. And I think it's a skill that can be learned. And I think that training your leadership to understand the best practices and the risks and the concerns around that particular topic can be very, very helpful. There's a lot of really good strategies they can learn and a lot of good tools that they can learn how to embrace a little bit better.
100% agree with that. It's you can. I know it's one of those things when belts are tightening to cut all the training. It's a huge mistake. I know that people hate to hear this, but with when the market's down, I'm one of those people who's like buy the dip. I'm like always. I try to always, in stocks that I'm trading in and that investments that I'm making, to look at downturns in the economy, like we're kind of experiencing ups and downs right now, to go and buy in the dip for long term. You're getting better value out of those things. I'm not worried about that. It may drop some more before it goes back up because I know long term I got good value out of that. Similar to training in organizations. Mm-hmm. Sorry, I went too long on the stock purchase thing.
No, it's an investment. What you're saying is it's an investment, right? Even though it costs time, money, and energy, it is an investment, and it is an investment with a fantastic ROI.
Yeah. Just to wrap up here, call to action. I like that we're starting to do this, include this in here. But if you are managing a geographically dispersed team, ask yourself, are we accommodating the realities of our team's location, or are we expecting them to conform to ours? It's a great 2 questions to ask. If you're a team member and you're feeling excluded or overburdened by this, document the patterns and propose changes to team norms that support more of this inclusion and flexibility, recognition of the differences. And then, pilot, try things out, suggest changes, at least document that. I know a lot of times, not a lot of times, sometimes, don't want to overstate it, sometimes, and you have leaders that are unwilling to make those changes. Hey, now you know. you know what kind of company that you're working for, and whether you want to go find a place that is more realistic to the differences globally and the stakeholder needs. So at least start a conversation with your leadership team about how your company supports or fails to support that diverse collaboration geographically.
And I think the thing to remember is that the first step to solving any problem is awareness and admitting of the problem. And so I think, when we say start conversations, the idea is if you are working with geographically, dispersed teams or clients or whatever, admit that that's a thing that you do have to deal with and start looking at ways that you can make it better.
Yeah. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching the episode. It's been a great discussion. As always, Sharon, it's been a lot of fun. And if you don't already follow us out on the interwebs, we're out in multiple locations. You can find us on Twitter, or whatever they're calling it these days, these kids, X. Blue Sky.
We need to switch that to follow us on generic social like enter platform here, whatever the platform of the day is.
Well, I need to add the icons in there, but we're all over the place. You can find us. Of course, you can find all the back episodes out on YouTube under Buckley Planet, or if you find Sharon's profile, again, all linked off there.
YouTube's the important one.
The YouTubes are fantastic. Yeah. So all the episodes that are out there, this being episode, what is this? 46. Wow. So that's 46 weeks in a row, folks. And we have another more than a year and a half of content like in the plan already. So yeah, we'll be doing this for a while now. But please also go to projectfailurefiles.com, sign up for the newsletter, leave us some feedback. And if you have suggestions for topics you'd like us to discuss, we can extend that complete date. I think we're booked through, I think it's almost to June with topics. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then other stuff that we'll do as well. Yeah. Anyway, well, thanks so much. Thanks for watching. And we'll be back next Monday, every Monday, 9 a.m. Pacific. And we'll see you there.
Bye, Christian.